The morning sun cast long shadows across McAllister Ranch, painting the rolling plains in hues of gold and amber. Jack "Iron" McAllister stood on his weathered porch, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon with the instinct of a man who'd spent decades reading the land's subtle warnings. His calloused hand rested on the porch railing as he watched his prized stallion Thunder, grazing peacefully in the morning light. The horse's coal-black coat gleamed like polished obsidian, his powerful muscles rippling with each graceful movement. Thunder wasn't just any horse. He was a legend in these parts, known for his unmatched speed and intelligence. Jack's face, weathered by years of sun and hardship, remained stoic as he noticed something that made his spine stiffen. In the distance, barely visible against the rising sun, dark figures moved along the horizon. Their approach was deliberate, calculated, like shadows creeping across the land. "The Black Spurs," he muttered under his breath, recognizing the notorious gang's signature formation. Even from this distance, their reputation preceded them. Outlaws who'd made a name for themselves stealing the finest horses across 3 territories. Inside the ranch house, Jack's trusted ranch hand, Billy, appeared with fresh coffee. "Something wrong, boss?" the young man asked, noting the tension in Jack's stance. "Trouble's brewing," Jack replied, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "Get your hands ready. Tell them to keep their eyes sharp but act natural. Don't want our visitors knowing we've spotted them." As Billy hurried off, Jack's mind drifted to the stories that had reached him about the Black Spurs. Led by Caleb Vane, they weren't just common thieves. They were calculated predators who studied their targets for weeks before striking. The fact that they'd shown themselves meant one thing: they were ready to make their move. Jack's hand unconsciously moved to his hip, where his revolver had rested countless times before. Though he'd hung up his gunslinger ways years ago, choosing the quiet life of a rancher, he hadn't forgotten the skills that had once made him one of the most feared men in the territory. Thunder lifted his head, ears pricking forward, as if sensing the tension in the air. The stallion's eyes met Jack's, and in that moment, a silent understanding passed between man and horse. They'd been through too much together to let anyone tear them apart. The morning wore on, peaceful on the surface, but Jack knew better. This was the quiet before the storm, and the Black Spurs were about to learn why Jack McAllister was called Iron. Because like the metal itself, he might bend, but he would never break. If this story has you on the edge of your seat, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever had to stand your ground to protect someone or something you love. And make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's story will leave you absolutely speechless. The saloon in Willow Creek fell silent as the Black Spurs strode through its swinging doors, their spurs jingling ominously with each step. Caleb Vane led the group, his presence commanding attention without effort. Tall and lean, with eyes cold as winter frost, he carried himself with the dangerous grace of a mountain lion. "Whiskey," he ordered, his voice smooth, yet carrying an edge that made the bartender's hands tremble slightly as he poured. The other patrons tried their best to look uninterested, but their stiff postures betrayed their unease. The Black Spurs had a reputation that preceded them. Where they went, trouble followed like thunder after lightning. Caleb's right-hand man, Snake Eyes Wilson, leaned against the bar, his scarred face scanning the room. "Word is, McAllister's got himself quite a horse," he said, keeping his voice low. "They say Thunder's faster than any horse this side of the Mississippi." "More than just fast," Caleb replied, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "That horse has something special. Saw him myself last week at the county fair. McAllister wouldn't even let him compete. Said it wouldn't be fair to the other horses." A slight smile played at the corners of his mouth. A horse like that could set us up for life south of the border. The saloon's old-timer, Doc Henderson, couldn't help but overhear. He'd known Jack McAllister for years, remembered when the man first arrived in these parts, his reputation as a gunslinger already legendary. "You boys might want to reconsider," he said, his voice carrying the weight of wisdom. "Iron McAllister ain't the kind of man you want to cross." Caleb turned slowly, his eyes fixing on the old man. "That so? Way I hear it, he's gone soft, trading his gun for a plow, living the quiet life." He stepped closer to Doc, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "The famous Iron McAllister. Nothing but a rancher now." "That's what the Rattler wants you to think too," Doc replied, standing his ground. "Right before it strikes." The saloon grew tenser still, but Caleb merely laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "Times are changing, old man. Legends like McAllister belong to the past. These days, it's men like us who write the stories." As the Black Spurs continued planning, the town's telegraph operator burst through the doors, waving a yellow paper. "Train robbery up north," he announced excitedly. "The Jensen gang hit the morning express." Caleb smiled, knowing this was exactly what they needed. With the law distracted by the robbery, their path to McAllister's ranch would be clear. He gathered his men with a subtle nod, leaving coins on the counter as they headed out. "Remember, boys," he said as they mounted up, "we move tonight. McAllister may have been someone once, but every man's got to learn when his time's past." The gang rode out of town, their black horses blending with the gathering dusk. While behind them, Doc Henderson hurried to send word to McAllister's ranch. The stage was set for a confrontation that would remind everyone why some legends never truly fade. 3 years earlier, on a storm-ravaged night, Jack McAllister had found Thunder. The stallion, barely more than a colt then, lay trapped in a ravine, his leg tangled in barbed wire. Most men would have ended the horse's suffering with a merciful bullet. But something in the young stallion's eyes caught Jack's attention, a fierce will to live that matched his own. "Easy there, boy," Jack had whispered, approaching slowly through the driving rain. Lightning crackled overhead, illuminating the scene in harsh bursts. The horse's coal-black coat was slick with rain and blood, but his eyes remained alert, watching Jack's every move. Despite his pain, Thunder didn't thrash or panic. He waited, seeming to understand that this man meant help, not harm. For hours, Jack worked in the darkness, carefully freeing the horse from the wire's cruel grip. His hands were cut and bleeding by the time he finished, but he never once considered giving up. When the last wire fell away, Thunder struggled to his feet, favoring his injured leg but refusing to fall. "You're a fighter," Jack had said, admiration clear in his voice. "Just like someone else I know." In the months that followed, Jack nursed Thunder back to health. The bond between them grew stronger with each passing day. While other horses needed to be broken, Thunder needed only to be guided. He seemed to understand Jack's commands before they were even given, moving like an extension of Jack's own body. Word of Thunder's remarkable abilities spread quickly through the territory. Traders offered small fortunes for him, but Jack refused them all. To him, Thunder wasn't just a horse. He was a reminder that sometimes the greatest strength comes from surviving your darkest moments. One afternoon, a group of army officers had visited the ranch looking to buy cavalry horses. Their commander, Colonel Webster, had spotted Thunder and immediately recognized his exceptional quality. "Name your price, McAllister," he'd said, pulling out his checkbook. "Every army in the world would kill for a horse like that." Jack's response was simple but firm. "He's not for sale at any price, Colonel. Some things are worth more than money." The colonel had studied Jack for a moment before nodding in understanding. "You're right about that, McAllister. Don't see many partnerships like yours these days." Now, as Jack watched the Black Spurs approaching from the horizon, those words echoed in his mind. Thunder wasn't just a prize to be stolen. He was family. The thought of Caleb Vane's gang trying to take him made Jack's blood boil, stirring something he'd tried to leave behind years ago. In the stable, Thunder sensed his master's unease. The stallion's ears flicked forward, his powerful body tensing as if preparing for the storm they both knew was coming. Jack ran his hand along Thunder's muscular neck, feeling the strength and loyalty that had made them inseparable. "Don't worry, boy," he whispered. his voice carrying a steel edge that hadn't been there in years. "They'll learn what happens when you mess with family." Night descended on McAllister Ranch like a heavy blanket, bringing with it an unsettling stillness. The moon hung low and full, casting long shadows across the property. Perfect conditions for those who preferred to work in darkness. Jack sat in his darkened study, his weathered face illuminated only by the faint glow of a dying lamp. Billy's hurried footsteps on the porch broke the silence. The young ranch hand burst through the door, his face flushed with urgency. "Mr. McAllister," he whispered, "saw movement by the south fence. At least 6 riders, moving slow and quiet-like." Jack nodded, already reaching for the old gun belt hanging by his desk. The leather was worn but well-maintained, just like the Colt revolver it carried. "Alert the other hands," he instructed, his voice steady and low. "Tell them to stay hidden until my signal. We're going to let these boys think they've got the element of surprise." As Billy slipped away, Jack checked his ammunition with practiced efficiency. Each bullet was a potential message to the Black Spurs, telling them they'd chosen the wrong ranch, the wrong horse, and definitely the wrong man to steal from. Through the window, Jack caught glimpses of dark figures moving between the shadows of the outbuildings. They were good, he had to admit that. Their approach was calculated, professional. But Jack hadn't survived this long by being careless. He'd positioned his most trusted hands strategically around the property, each one armed and ready. In the stable, Thunder stirred restlessly, sensing the tension in the air. The stallion's soft nickering carried through the night, and Jack knew the Black Spurs would interpret it as a sign of an easy target. Just another horse in just another stable. They had no idea that Thunder was as alert and ready as his master. Jack moved silently through his house, years of experience guiding his steps around every creaking floorboard. Through the back door, he could see Caleb Vane's silhouette approaching the stable, his gang spreading out in a practiced formation. Their black dusters blended with the darkness, but their confidence had made them careless. Jack could read their movements like a book. "Just like old times," Jack muttered, feeling the familiar weight of his revolver in his hand. The weapon felt like a natural extension of his arm, awakening muscle memories from years past. He'd hoped never to need these skills again, but some things you never truly forget. Billy's signal came. 3 short whistles disguised as a nightbird's call. The Black Spurs were fully committed now, too focused on their prize to notice they were walking into a trap. Jack moved toward the stable, his boots silent on the packed earth. The time for watching was over. Inside the stable, Thunder's powerful hooves struck the ground once, then twice, a warning that strangers approached. Jack allowed himself a grim smile. The Black Spurs thought they were hunting, but they were about to learn what it felt like to be the prey. The stable's heavy wooden doors creaked open, and Caleb Vane stepped into the lantern-lit interior, his confidence evident in every movement. The soft glow illuminated his face, revealing a smile that didn't quite reach his cold eyes. Behind him, Snake Eyes Wilson and 2 other members of the Black Spurs spread out, their hands hovering near their holsters. "Evening, McAllister," Caleb called out, his voice carrying that same dangerous smoothness from his saloon conversation. "Figured we'd find you here." Jack emerged from the shadows, positioning himself between the Outlaws and Thunder's stall. His stance was relaxed, but his eyes held the sharp focus of a predator. "You've got about 10 seconds to leave my property, Caleb. After that, things get complicated." Thunder's powerful frame filled his stall, his dark eyes fixed on the intruders. The stallion remained eerily still, as if understanding the gravity of the moment. Caleb's gaze shifted between horse and man, his smile widening slightly. "Now, Jack, is that any way to treat old friends? We both know how this ends. You're outnumbered, and times have changed. The West isn't what it used to be. Neither are you." "That's where you're wrong," Jack replied, his voice carrying the weight of steel. "Some things don't change, like what happens to men who try to steal what isn't theirs." Snake Eyes moved slightly to the left, attempting to flank Jack, but stopped cold when Jack's eyes flickered to him. "I wouldn't," Jack warned. Your reputation's built on stealing from ordinary folks. I'm anything but ordinary." Caleb's hand inched toward his gun. "The famous Iron McAllister. They used to say you were the fastest draw in 3 territories. But legends fade, old friend. Now you're just a rancher with a prize horse he can't protect." The tension in the stable grew thick enough to cut with a knife. Outside, the night had gone completely silent. Even the crickets seemed to be holding their breath. Jack's reply came soft but clear. "Last chance, Caleb. Walk away." Instead of responding, Caleb's hand dropped to his holster. But before he could clear leather, a shot rang out. Not from inside the stable, but from the darkness beyond. The bullet splintered the wooden beam next to Caleb's head, showering him with fragments. Chaos erupted. The Black Spurs drew their weapons, but found themselves caught in a crossfire as Jack's hidden ranch hands opened fire from strategic positions. Thunder reared in his stall, his powerful hooves striking the wooden walls with devastating force. In the confusion, Snake Eyes managed to squeeze off a shot. The bullet grazed Jack's shoulder, drawing blood but failing to slow him down. Jack's return fire was precise, catching Snake Eyes in the arm and sending his gun clattering across the stable floor. The standoff had exploded into all-out war, and the night was far from over. Through the chaos of gunfire and splintering wood, Caleb Vane revealed why the Black Spurs had earned their notorious reputation. With a sharp whistle, his men executed a coordinated assault that caught even Jack's experienced hands off guard. 2 outlaws tossed smoke bombs into the stable, filling the space with thick, choking clouds. "Get Thunder!" Caleb's voice cut through the confusion. The sound of breaking wood echoed as they forced their way into the stallion's stall. Jack, fighting through the smoke and the pain of his wounded shoulder, heard Thunder's distressed whinny. The stallion's powerful hooves connected with something solid. A grunt of pain suggested one of the outlaws had gotten too close, but the Black Spurs had come prepared. A peculiar hissing sound preceded Thunder's sudden, confused snort. "Ether!" Jack realized too late. They'd brought ether to subdue his horse. Through the thinning smoke, he caught glimpses of the outlaws wrestling with Thunder, who fought against the drug's effects with all his legendary strength. But even Thunder couldn't resist the chemical's power forever. "Jack!" Billy's voice called out from somewhere outside. "They're heading for the south gate!" Jack burst from the stable, his gun blazing, but the Black Spurs had planned their escape well. Covering fire from multiple directions forced him and his men to take cover. By the time they could respond, Caleb's men had already loaded the subdued Thunder onto a waiting wagon. "Remember what I said about legends fading, McAllister?" Caleb called out from atop his horse, his voice carrying a note of triumph. "Thanks for proving my point!" The wagon burst into motion, surrounded by mounted riders. Jack managed to drop one of the outlaws with a well-placed shot, but the others escaped into the darkness, taking Thunder with them. The sound of hoofbeats faded into the night, leaving behind a scene of destruction and the bitter taste of defeat. "Billy!" Jack's voice carried the kind of authority that demanded immediate response. "Get inside. Send telegrams to every town within 50 miles. I want eyes on every trail, every pass, every possible route they might take." As his hands scrambled to follow orders, Jack knelt beside the outlaw he'd shot. The man was alive, clutching his shoulder and grimacing in pain. "Where are they taking him?" Jack demanded. The wounded outlaw spat at Jack's feet. "Go to hell, McAllister." Jack's eyes hardened. "Son, I've been to hell. Now I'm bringing it with me." He turned to his gathered men. "Patch him up, then lock him in the cellar. I need to make some visits." "What kind of visits?" Billy asked, noting the dangerous glint in his boss's eyes. "The kind that reminds people why they used to call me Iron," Jack replied, checking his ammunition. "I've got old friends who owe me favors, riders who know every trail and canyon in these territories. The Black Spurs think they've won, but they just started a war they can't finish." Dawn painted the sky in shades of crimson as Jack and his hastily assembled posse cut through the morning mist. The group made an impressive sight. hardened men who'd answered Jack's call without hesitation. Among them rode Tom "Hawkeye" Henderson, a legendary scout who could track a ghost through a sandstorm, and the Martinez brothers, whose knowledge of the border territories was unmatched. "Tracks head southeast," Hawkeye called out, studying the ground with practiced eyes. "They're pushing hard, but that wagon's slowing them down. Thunder's fighting them too. See here?" He pointed to irregular marks in the dirt. "They've had to stop multiple times to handle him." Jack felt a surge of pride. Even drugged, Thunder wasn't making it easy for his captors. The thought of his horse in their hands sent a fresh wave of anger through him, but he forced it down. Anger made men careless, and he couldn't afford mistakes. "Jack," Miguel Martinez spoke up, his voice carrying years of border wisdom. "There's only one place they could be heading: Dead Man's Canyon. It's the only route south that can handle a wagon and offer enough cover from the law." The name stirred old memories. 15 years ago, Jack had tracked another gang through that same canyon. The ensuing shootout had become legend, earning him the nickname Iron for surviving what should have been certain death. "Caleb knows that story," Jack said grimly. "He's counting on me remembering it, trying to make me hesitate." "Will you?" Tom asked, studying his old friend's face. Jack's expression hardened. "The only thing I'm remembering is how it ended for them." They rode hard through the morning, eating up miles with grim determination. The trail led them through harsh country, the kind that broke lesser men and horses. But Jack's assembled team was far from ordinary. Each man had his own history with him, debts of honor that ran deeper than blood. Around midday, they found the first sign that they were gaining ground. An abandoned campsite, ashes still warm, told the story of the Black Spur's growing desperation. Thunder's tracks showed he was still fighting, still refusing to submit to their control. "They're pushing too hard," Hawkeye observed, examining scattered supplies they'd left behind. "Making mistakes." "Caleb's frustrated," Jack agreed. He thought once they had Thunder, the hard part was over. Didn't count on the horse being as stubborn as his owner. A memory flashed through Jack's mind. The night he'd found Thunder in that ravine. The determination in those eyes that matched his own. Now, as then, their fates were intertwined. But this time, it was Jack doing the saving. "They're less than 4 hours ahead," Miguel announced, reading the signs. "And the canyon's still a day's ride away." Jack checked his gun, a gesture that had become second nature over the years. "Then we've got them, because they're about to learn something about Thunder that Caleb never figured out." "What's that?" Tom asked. "That horse knows my whistle, and when he hears it, there's not a force on earth that can hold him back." The abandoned mining town of Devil's Rest loomed before the Black Spurs like a skeleton bleached by the desert sun. Caleb Vane guided his men through the weathered buildings, their horses' hooves stirring up dust that had settled over decades of abandonment. "Get that wagon hidden," he ordered, gesturing toward an old livery stable. "And make sure that damn horse stays quiet. McAllister's closer than I'd like." Thunder, still fighting the effects of the ether, was led into the stable. The magnificent stallion's coat was dulled by dust and sweat, but his eyes remained defiant. 2 men struggled with the ropes that held him, earning sharp kicks for their trouble. Snake Eyes, his arm crudely bandaged from Jack's bullet, approached Caleb. "We should just kill the horse," he growled. "Ain't worth all this trouble." Caleb rounded on him, eyes flashing. "That horse is worth more than you'll see in 10 lifetimes. Besides," he added, a cold smile playing across his face, "he's our insurance. McAllister's coming, and when he does, that horse is going to help us end his legend once and for all." The Outlaws worked quickly, setting up their trap. Sharp shooters were positioned in the abandoned hotel and church steeple, offering clear views of every approach. Tripwires were strung between buildings, and explosive charges were carefully placed at strategic points. "Iron McAllister's about to learn that times have changed," Caleb announced to his men. "The day of the lone gunslinger is over. Today, we write the ending to his story." But even as he spoke, doubt gnawed at him. He'd heard stories of McAllister's exploits for years, tales that seemed impossible until you saw the cold certainty in the man's eyes. The same eyes that had stared him down in that stable, showing not a trace of fear despite being outnumbered. From his position in the hotel, one of the lookouts suddenly tensed. "Riders coming, about a mile out, moving slow." Caleb smiled. "Right on schedule. Everyone knows their positions. Remember, McAllister's mine. Deal with his friends, however you want." Thunder's angry whinny echoed through the ghost town, as if sensing the approaching conflict. The sound made several of the black spurs shift uneasily. They'd stolen plenty of horses before, but this one was different. This one watched them like he understood exactly what was happening. "Settle down," Caleb snapped, noticing his men's discomfort. "It's just a horse, and McAllister's just a man. After today, both those facts will be clear to everyone." But as the dust cloud on the horizon grew larger, even Caleb couldn't quite shake the feeling that he might have underestimated both horse and rider. Something about the way McAllister had looked at him in that stable, something about the way Thunder refused to be broken. It sparked memories of old stories about unbeatable men and unstoppable horses. The trap was set, but Caleb was beginning to wonder who was really being trapped. The sun hung directly overhead as Jack and his men approached Devil's Rest, the harsh light casting stark shadows that could hide a dozen gunmen. They rode slowly, deliberately, their horses' hooves kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. "They're in there all right," Hawkeye muttered, his keen eyes scanning the abandoned buildings. "Got men in the church tower, hotel, and probably that old saloon. Classic ambush setup." Jack raised his hand, bringing the group to a halt just outside the town's limits. From somewhere within the maze of weathered buildings came Thunder's distinctive whinny, a sound of defiance rather than distress. A small smile touched Jack's lips. His horse hadn't given up the fight. "Caleb!" Jack's voice carried across the empty street, echoing off the dead buildings. "I'm giving you one last chance. Release my horse, and we can end this without bloodshed." Caleb's laugh rang out from his hidden position. "Always the honorable one, aren't you, Jack? But honor died with the Old West. This is business, pure and simple." "Nothing pure or simple about stealing another man's horse," Jack replied, his voice hardening. "Or about hiding behind an ambush when you do it. Times change, old friend. The day of the lone gunslinger is over. Look around you. You're surrounded, outnumbered, and outmaneuvered. That's not very honorable either, is it?" As if to emphasize his point, more of the black spurs emerged from their hiding spots, guns trained on Jack and his men. They had indeed prepared well, covering every angle of approach. "Last chance, Caleb," Jack warned, though his tone suggested he knew what the answer would be. "No, Jack, this is your last chance. Ride away, forget the horse, live to see another sunset." Instead of responding, Jack let out a sharp, distinctive whistle that cut through the tense air like a knife. From within the stable, Thunder's powerful response was immediate, the sound of splintering wood followed by the thunder of hooves. The black spurs hadn't expected this. Thunder burst through the stable doors, sending two outlaws flying. The magnificent stallion, finally free of the ether's effects, caused instant chaos among Caleb's carefully positioned men. "Now!" Jack commanded, and his men sprang into action. The Martinez brothers laid down covering fire, while Hawkeye's deadly accurate shots forced the sharpshooters to abandon their positions. In the confusion, Caleb emerged from his hiding place, his face contorted with rage. "Kill them all!" he shouted, firing wildly at Jack. But Jack had already dismounted, rolling behind cover as bullets sparked off the ground around him. This was what he'd been waiting for, a chance to face Caleb man to man, to settle things the old way. "You wanted to end my legend, Caleb?" Jack called out, his voice carrying the edge of steel that had made him famous. "Then come and do it yourself." The streets of Devil's Rest erupted into a full-scale war zone. Gunfire echoed off weathered buildings as Jack and Caleb circled each other like wolves, each seeking an opening. Around them, their men were locked in their own desperate battles, but for these two, the world had narrowed to just this moment. "You know what your problem is, Jack?" Caleb called out, ducking behind an overturned wagon. "You never learned to let go of the past. The world's changed, but you're still playing by old rules." Jack moved like a shadow between buildings, his boots silent on the dusty ground. "Some rules don't change, Caleb, like paying for what you steal." A bullet splintered the wood near Jack's head, but he didn't flinch. He'd been in worse situations, faced deadlier odds. Through the chaos, he could hear thunder somewhere in the background, his powerful hooves dealing with any outlaw foolish enough to approach him. "You think you're still the legend they talk about?" Caleb's voice dripped with contempt. "The great Iron McAllister? Look at you, hiding behind cover like any common gunslinger." "Not hiding," Jack replied calmly. "Waiting." The moment Caleb shifted position, Jack made his move. His first shot caught the outlaw's hat, sending it spinning into the dust. Caleb returned fire, but Jack was already moving, closing the distance between them with deadly purpose. They ended up face to face in the middle of the street, guns drawn, barely 10 paces apart. The fighting around them seemed to pause, as if everyone sensed the magnitude of this moment. "Just like old times," Caleb sneered, his gun steady despite the sweat on his brow. "Remember when we rode together, Jack, before you got soft and decided to play rancher?" "I remember." Jack's voice was cold as winter steel. "I also remember why we parted ways. You didn't just get greedy, Caleb. You got cruel, started enjoying the pain you caused." Thunder's powerful form appeared at the end of the street, watching the standoff with intelligent eyes. The stallion's presence seemed to unnerve Caleb, whose gun hand trembled slightly. "It's over, Caleb," Jack said firmly. "Drop the gun. Face justice like a man." Instead, Caleb's face twisted with rage. His gun moved with snake-like speed, but Jack was faster, had always been faster. 2 shots rang out almost simultaneously. Caleb's bullet whizzed past Jack's ear, close enough to feel its passage. Jack's shot, however, found its mark. Caleb stumbled backward, his gun falling from nerveless fingers as he clutched his shoulder. "You didn't kill me!" Caleb gasped, surprise evident in his voice. "No," Jack agreed, keeping his gun trained on his fallen opponent. "That's another rule that hasn't changed. Justice comes from the law, not the gun." Thunder galloped across the dusty street toward Jack, his powerful strides eating up the distance between them. The stallion's coat was dusty and marked from his ordeal, but his spirit remained unbroken. Jack holstered his gun and reached out as Thunder approached, his weathered hand finding its familiar place on the horse's strong neck. "Gave them hell, didn't you, boy?" Jack murmured, noting the scattered evidence of Thunder's resistance: broken ropes, a damaged wagon, and more than a few black spurs nursing various kicks and bites. The horse pressed his head against Jack's chest, a gesture of trust and relief that spoke louder than words. Hawkeyes approached, keeping a watchful eye on the subdued outlaws. "He's got some rope burns on his legs, Jack, and they worked him pretty hard trying to control him. Might want to have Doc Peterson take a look when we get back." Jack carefully examined Thunder's legs, his experienced hands gentle but thorough. The injuries were superficial. Thunder had suffered worse during their early days together. Still, each mark left by the black spurs made Jack's jaw tighten with controlled anger. "Your horse," Caleb spoke up from where he sat, clutching his wounded shoulder. "He ain't natural. No horse fights like that. No horse understands like that." Jack turned to face his former friend, Thunder, standing protectively at his side. "That's where you were wrong from the start, Caleb. You saw Thunder as just another horse to steal. But he's more than that. He's loyal, trust, and heart. Things you wouldn't understand." The Martinez brothers had finished securing the surviving black spurs, their expert knots ensuring none would escape before the law arrived. The ghost town had become a makeshift prison, with outlaws sitting dejectedly in the shade of the old buildings. "The telegraph office in the next town still works," Miguel reported. "Send word to the sheriff. They'll be here by sundown." Jack nodded, his attention still focused on Thunder. The stallion's eyes were alert, scanning the surroundings as if ensuring all threats had truly been neutralized. Despite his ordeal, he stood proud and strong, embodying the spirit that had first caught Jack's attention years ago. "You know what amazes me?" Tom said, watching horse and rider. "After everything they did to him, the first thing that horse did was look for you. Didn't run wild, didn't bolt for freedom. Come straight to your side." "That's because he knows where he belongs," Jack replied, a rare smile softening his features. "Some bonds can't be broken by force or fear. The Black Spurs never understood that. They thought everything had a price, that anything could be stolen if you were bold enough." Thunder nickered softly, nudging Jack's shoulder as if agreeing with his words. The morning's first light was giving way to the heat of day, but neither man nor horse seemed eager to move. They had earned this moment of quiet reunion. Just as Jack was preparing to lead Thunder home, a commotion erupted from the far end of the ghost town. Billy came stumbling into view, his hands bound behind his back, with Snake Eyes holding a gun to his temple. The outlaw's face was twisted with desperation, his wounded arm hanging useless at his side. "Nobody moves," Snake Eyes shouted, his voice cracking with barely controlled panic. "Drop your guns, or the boy dies." Jack's hand froze halfway to his holster. Billy's face was bruised, but his eyes held steady, showing the same quiet courage that had made Jack hire him in the first place. Somehow, Snake Eyes must have slipped away during the chaos and circled back to the ranch, taking Billy hostage. "Let him go, Snake," Jack said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "You're just making things worse for yourself." "Worse?" Snake Eyes laughed, the sound tinged with hysteria. "Look around! The gang's finished, Caleb's caught, and I'm looking at 20 years hard labor. Only thing keeping me alive right now is this boy." Thunder shifted restlessly beside Jack, sensing the tension. The stallion's ears were pricked forward, his muscles tense as if ready to spring. Jack placed a calming hand on his neck, though his mind was racing through possibilities. "Think about it," Jack continued, keeping his voice level. "You kill him. There's no walking away from that. Every lawman in 3 territories will hunt you down. But let him go now. Surrender peacefully. Maybe the judge shows leniency." Snake Eyes' gun hand trembled slightly. "Leniency? That's not how it works anymore, McAllister. World's changed, remember? No mercy for outlaws these days." "There's always a choice," Jack replied, taking a careful step forward. "Just like there's always consequences." "Stay back!" Snake Eyes pressed the gun harder against Billy's head. "I mean it. One more step and—" What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Billy, sensing his captor's wavering attention, suddenly dropped his weight, throwing Snake Eyes off balance. At the same instant, Thunder reared up with a powerful whinny, the unexpected movement startling the outlaw further. Jack's draw was lightning fast, but he didn't fire. He didn't need to. Snake Eyes, stumbling backward, tripped over a hidden piece of lumber. His gun discharged harmlessly into the air as he fell, and before he could recover, he found himself surrounded by leveled weapons. "You okay, Billy?" Jack asked, quickly moving to cut the young man's bonds. "Yes, sir," Billy replied, rubbing his wrists. "Knew you'd come, though I gotta admit, I didn't expect Thunder to help with the rescue." Jack smiled, patting Thunder's neck. "Like I told Caleb, he's more than just a horse. He's family. And the family looks out for each other." Snake Eyes lay in the dust, all fight gone from him as the Martinez brothers secured his hands. The last desperate gambit of the Black Spurs had failed, broken against the unshakable bond between a man, his horse, and the people they protected. The canyon walls rose like ancient sentinels on either side as Jack led the procession of captured outlaws toward town. The setting sun painted the rocks in shades of blood red, casting long shadows across the narrow trail. Thunder walked beside him, still alert despite the day's events, while the Black Spurs shuffled along under the watchful eyes of Jack's men. Caleb, his shoulder bandaged but his spirit unbroken, couldn't seem to keep quiet. "You're a fool, Jack," he called out. "Could have had it all. The money, the power, respect. Instead, you choose to play cowboy with your precious horse." "That's always been your problem, Caleb," Jack replied without turning. "You never understood the difference between respect and fear." Suddenly, a rifle shot echoed through the canyon. One of Caleb's men, who'd escaped during the initial fight, had positioned himself on the high rocks, and now more hidden outlaws emerged from concealed positions. "Get down!" Jack shouted as bullets kicked up dust around them. The canyon had become a killing ground, with gunfire ricocheting off the rock walls. Thunder reacted instantly, positioning himself between the gunfire and Billy, who'd been walking nearby. The stallion's protective instinct matched his master's, showing once again why they were more than just horse and rider. "We got shooters on both ridges," Hawkeye called out, returning fire with deadly accuracy. "They must have planned this backup all along." Jack's mind raced. They were exposed in the canyon, with limited cover and prisoners to protect. But he knew these walls, knew every crack and crevice from years of riding through them. More importantly, he knew something the Black Spurs didn't. "Miguel, the old mining tunnel!" he shouted. 20 yards ahead on the left." Understanding flashed in Miguel Martinez's eyes. The abandoned tunnel was narrow but deep enough to provide shelter while they dealt with the ambush. As they fought their way forward, Caleb saw his chance. Despite his wound, he managed to break free in the chaos, grabbing a fallen gun and scrambling up the canyon wall toward his hidden men. "Not this time," Jack muttered. With a sharp whistle to Thunder, he began scaling the rocks after Caleb. The stallion, understanding instantly, moved to cut off any escape route back down the canyon. Bullets sparked off the rocks around them as Jack climbed, but his focus was singular. This had to end here, in these ancient walls that had seen so many legends born and die. Behind him, he could hear his men providing covering fire, keeping the other outlaws pinned down while he pursued their leader. At the top of the ridge, Caleb turned to face him, gun raised. "Looks like we get our duel after all, old friend," he said, blood seeping through his bandaged shoulder. "But this time, there's no honor in it, just survival." Jack steadied himself on the narrow ledge, the drop behind him promising certain death if he stepped wrong. "That's where you're wrong again, Caleb. There's always honor in doing what's right." The canyon waited, holding its breath for what would come next. The final confrontation between Jack McAllister and Caleb Vane played out against the blazing sunset, their shadows stretching long across the canyon rocks. Below, Thunder watched intently, his powerful form silhouetted against the deepening dusk, while the scattered gunfire from the remaining outlaws gradually fell silent. "Look at us," Caleb said, his gun steady despite his wound. "Two relics of the Old West, fighting over a horse. World's moved on, Jack. Men like us don't belong anymore." "The world always needs men who stand for something, Caleb," Jack replied, his voice carrying across the evening air. "That's what you never understood. It's not about belonging. It's about believing." The shot came without warning, Caleb's finger tightening on the trigger in one desperate bid for victory. But Jack had been ready and had read it in his old friend's eyes. He moved like lightning, his own gun speaking once, twice. The first shot took Caleb's weapon, sending it spinning into the canyon. The second struck him clean in the leg, dropping him to the rocky ground. From below, cheers erupted as the remaining Black Spurs, seeing their leader fall, finally surrendered. The legendary gang that had terrorized 3 territories was finished, broken by one man's unwavering stand. Thunder's proud whinny echoed through the canyon as Jack helped Caleb down from the ridge. The stallion approached them, his eyes fixed on Caleb with an almost knowing look. "Remarkable animal," Caleb muttered, his bravado finally fading. "Worth more than gold." "That's where you were wrong from the start," Jack said, securing Caleb's bonds. "His worth isn't in money. It's in loyalty, trust, and heart. Things you can't steal or sell." As the sun disappeared behind the canyon walls, the law arrived from town. Sheriff Cooper himself had come, having heard it was the black spurs they'd captured. He watched with admiration as Jack's men handed over their prisoners. "The legend of Iron McAllister grows again," the sheriff said with a smile. Jack shook his head, running his hand along Thunder's powerful neck. "No more legends, Sheriff, just a man and his horse, doing what needed to be done." Later that evening, as they rode back to the ranch, Billy spoke up. "Mr. McAllister, what you said about standing for something, do you really believe the world still needs that?" Jack looked at the young man, then at Thunder, who carried himself with the same proud dignity he'd shown since that first night in the ravine. "Times change, Billy, but principles don't. Honor, loyalty, standing up for what's right, those things are timeless, just like the bond between a man and his horse." Thunder nickered softly, as if agreeing with his master's words. The stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, eternal witnesses to both the Old West and the New, to legends and truths, to the unbreakable bond between a remarkable horse and the man who saw his true worth. If you enjoyed this tale of loyalty and courage, make sure to subscribe and ring that bell. Tomorrow's story will take you on another unforgettable journey that you won't want to miss.